A racist police officer strangled the wrong black woman inside the courthouse, believing his hatred would once again go unpunished. What he didn't know was that the woman he publicly assaulted wasn't just another bystander. She was his superior. And what she did to him afterward left everyone in that courtroom speechless, including the very system that had allowed him to walk unchecked for so long. It all started on a humid Thursday morning in a packed courthouse where tensions were already high. The hallway buzzed with voices and the clicking of heels on marble floors. People were rushing between rooms, clerks carrying stacks of files, lawyers whispering strategies to clients, and officers, like him, patrolling like they owned the place. She walked in quietly, dressed with elegance, confidence in her posture, and calm in her eyes. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. But to him, the mere presence of a black woman in the restricted wing of the courthouse was too much. Too free. Too fearless. Too proud. That, to him, was a threat. He saw her standing near courtroom B, holding a folder in her arms. Not causing trouble. Not raising her voice. Not interfering with anyone. Yet, something in him snapped. He walked up to her and barked, "You're not supposed to be here. Who let you in?" She looked at him, unfazed, and replied, "I have clearance." "Step aside, officer." That single sentence, clear, poised, assertive, stripped him of the illusion of control he thought he had. And in front of dozens of people, attorneys, clerks, journalists, and witnesses, he grabbed her by the arm, threw her against the wall, and wrapped his forearm around her neck. The hallway fell into silence, broken only by her gasping breath and the sound of phones recording. People shouted, but no one stepped forward. His voice roared, "This is what happens when you people think you run things. You think you're above the law now?" And just before she lost consciousness, she managed to say, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Those words, they didn't sound like fear. They sounded like warning. Like promise. The next 10 seconds would change his life forever. The courthouse exploded with movement. Security stormed the hallway, pulling him off of her. She collapsed to the floor, coughing, struggling to breathe, but still, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at him, her eyes not of a victim, but of someone who had just confirmed something important. He kept shouting, claiming she had resisted, that she was a threat, that he was following protocol. But the cameras told a different story. The room, now full of eyes and whispers, started to shift. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then the silence broke with a whisper that traveled faster than any voice. "Do you even know who she is?" She stood back up, slowly, brushing off her clothes. Her breathing shallow, but steady. She walked over to the lead security officer and said something none of them expected, "Please escort this man to holding. I'll handle it from here." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. But no one else laughed. She pulled out a badge, one that didn't belong to any low-level employee. One that made jaws drop. She wasn't a secretary. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't a member of the public who had wandered into the wrong place. She was their boss. People started to panic, not for her, but for him. He had just physically assaulted a high-ranking legal authority in one of the most heavily surveilled buildings in the state. And the only reason why he did it? Because she was black and standing confidently in a place where he thought she didn't belong. His assumptions had cost him everything in less than 2 minutes. But what happened after, what she did next, is what no one saw coming. The cameras didn't stop rolling. The story didn't stay in that hallway. By the time the sun went down, the video had gone viral. News outlets were flooding the airwaves with headlines like "Officer Attacks Own Superior," and "Racial Profiling Ends Career of Top Cop." But the real shock didn't come from the public outrage, it came from how she chose to handle it. She didn't sue. Not at first. She didn't lash out or disappear from the spotlight. Instead, she requested an emergency disciplinary hearing. Not behind closed doors, but in open court. And she demanded that the officer who assaulted her face the exact same justice system he believed would always protect him. She knew the loopholes. She knew the excuses. And most importantly, she knew the system better than he ever would. As the courthouse filled up again, this time with national media, civil rights leaders, legal experts, and high-profile attorneys, one question echoed louder than the rest: how does a man like that get hired, trained, promoted, and then protected after doing something like this? But there's another question even more important. Why did she let it go that far before revealing who she really was? Was it strategy? Was it a trap? Or was it something deeper, something that had been planned for much longer than anyone realized? What if she had been watching him all along? And what if this moment wasn't an accident? What happens next, inside that courtroom, changes everything. Stay until the end. Because you won't believe what she does with the power he never thought she had. Before we begin, we want to say this clearly: Plow of Twist stands firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. If you're a black viewer watching this, we want you to know, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. This channel believes in justice, representation, and the power of storytelling to spark change and awareness. Now, get ready for a powerful story. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into today's twist. Baltimore had always been a city of contradictions. Where row houses lined the blocks in neat rows, but poverty whispered through the cracks in the pavement. Where the sirens of justice wailed through the night, but justice itself rarely showed up on time. It was in this city, gritty, vibrant, wounded and beautiful, that Marlene Whitaker had built her name brick by brick, never waiting for permission to belong. She was tall, commanding, the type of woman whose silence spoke louder than most men's shouting. Her presence in a room rearranged the air. And yet, she never used that power to intimidate, only to affirm that she deserved to be exactly where she stood. With deep brown skin, tightly coiled natural hair always pinned up into a low bun, and eyes that didn't miss a thing, Marlene was the kind of woman who had grown used to being underestimated, and had learned to let it serve her. She was the newly appointed Deputy Director of Legal Oversight for the state of Maryland, a role few black women had ever held, much less with the quiet force she carried. Her job, at its core, was to supervise the ethics and conduct of law enforcement agencies across the state. A watchdog. A voice in rooms where policy was shaped. But she didn't come from a legacy of politics. Marlene had been raised by a single mother in West Baltimore, in a neighborhood where the only thing more common than eviction notices were broken promises. She learned early that intelligence wasn't enough, you had to know when to use it, and when to keep it hidden. That's what made her brilliant in courtrooms, lethal in meetings, and invisible to people like Officer Thomas Greer. Greer, on the other hand, was everything Marlene had worked her life to outgrow. He was the embodiment of a system that rewarded aggression over thoughtfulness, loyalty over accountability. A career cop, mid-40s, with a square jaw and a short temper, he had risen through the ranks not through merit, but through unshakable alliances and a talent for spinning his misconduct into miscommunication. His record was checkered, but never enough to cost him anything. Always on administrative leave. Always cleared. His colleagues called him old school, a compliment in their eyes, a warning in everyone else's. To Greer, the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who kept order and those who disrupted it. And anyone who challenged his authority, even silently, was already on the wrong side. He didn't know who Marlene was. All he saw that day was a black woman standing too comfortably in a corridor reserved for officers and prosecutors. She wasn't loud, wasn't causing a scene, but something about her still got under his skin. She carried herself like she belonged. No badge visible. No nameplate. Just confidence, and that was more than enough to trigger him. That morning had begun like any other. Marlene had arrived at the courthouse early, as she always did, her briefcase in one hand, her ID in the other. She had a meeting with the Judicial Ethics Board scheduled at 9:15 a.m., one floor up from the courtroom where a controversial police brutality case was underway. A young black teenager had accused two officers of excessive force during a traffic stop, and public attention had surged after body cam footage went missing. Marlene had been watching closely, not because she was assigned to the case, but because she knew the signs when systems started to cover their tracks. Outside the courtroom, tensions were already thick. Families clustered near doors, lawyers whispered urgently into phones, and protesters held up signs just beyond the steps. Inside the hallway, things were less chaotic but no less tense. Marlene stood by the wall, reviewing her notes, when she noticed a young intern, a Hispanic girl, barely 20, being questioned aggressively by Officer Greer. The girl's hands were shaking as she explained she had misplaced her visitor badge. She wasn't rude, just nervous. Marlene observed for a moment, her instinct alert. She approached quietly, placing a calm hand on the intern's shoulder, and said she could vouch for her. That she had seen the girl earlier at the front desk. It was a simple intervention. To Greer, it was an offense. He turned, eyes narrowing as he scanned Marlene from head to toe, not with interest but with suspicion. "You work here?" he asked, voice low, aggressive. Marlene met his stare with equal weight and replied, "I'm authorized to be on this floor." "Is there a problem?" That was it. No raised voice. No challenge. Just facts. But Greer was already spiraling, puffing up like a man whose fragile sense of power had just been cracked open. "You don't get to question protocol," he snapped. "You're interfering with an officer on duty." She didn't flinch. "I'm not interfering. I'm clarifying. If you have a concern, we can escalate this through proper channels." That word, channels, set something off in him. Because channels meant structure, meant oversight. And oversight was what Greer hated most. That's when it happened. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her against the wall. It wasn't chaotic. It was cold. Calculated. Mechanical. He held her there, tightening his grip, then forced her into a chokehold that dropped her to her knees. People froze. Phones came out. A clerk screamed. Marlene gasped for air but didn't struggle. She looked him in the eye, and whispered, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." In that moment, she wasn't a woman being restrained. She was a witness collecting evidence. Everything unraveled quickly after that. Security rushed in, staff pulled Greer off her, and Marlene fell to the ground, disheveled but still composed. Not a word of panic. Just silence, like a storm waiting to speak. She pulled herself up slowly, dusted off her sleeves, and addressed the senior security officer by name. "Please remove him from the premises." Effective immediately. That was the first moment anyone realized she wasn't just another observer. She had authority. And not the kind that came with a nameplate or uniform, but the kind that came with power. Greer was stunned. His face flushed, voice hoarse from shouting. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded. And then came the whisper from behind, "Someone in the crowd, maybe a clerk, maybe a paralegal, that's Deputy Director Whitaker." The name hit the room like a dropped gavel. Greer's mouth opened but no sound came out. It was too late. The badge was out. The cameras were rolling. And the woman he had just attacked now had the entire legal system watching. But what no one in that courthouse knew, not the clerks, not the reporters, not even Marlene's closest colleagues, was that she hadn't come there by chance. She hadn't just happened to witness that moment. She had known his name long before he ever laid eyes on her. And while everyone else saw a spontaneous act of racism, Marlene knew it was proof. Proof of a pattern. Proof of a system rotting from within. What would she do now, with the full weight of the law behind her? How would she use the silence that followed that assault, silence not from fear, but from calculation? The city would soon find out. But one thing was already certain. That hallway wouldn't forget her. And neither would he. The courtroom was silent, thick with anticipation and the weight of something that felt bigger than any one person in the room. The video paused on the screen, a freeze frame of Greer pinning Marlene to the wall, his arm cutting across her throat, her body pressed sideways in a posture of resistance without retaliation. You could hear people breathing, swallowing, shifting in their seats, but no one dared speak. Even the reporters had put down their pens. Everyone was waiting for the next move. And Marlene, seated at the front, remained motionless, composed, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. It wasn't anger. It was precision. Because what came next wasn't a moment of vengeance. It was the unsealing of a plan long in motion. "Resume playback," she said, her voice calm but absolute. The footage on screen jumped forward, not to more of the same video, but to something different. A recording dated 2 years earlier. A young man, thin, black, maybe early 20s, sitting in an interrogation room, his knuckles visibly bruised, lips swollen. No lawyer. Just Greer standing in front of him, pacing. His tone condescending, aggressive, as he leaned in too close, his voice captured by the audio. "You people think we owe you explanations? You better shut your mouth before I make this worse for you." The boy didn't speak. He just stared at the wall. Another clip followed, bodycam footage that had mysteriously gone missing during an investigation. This one showed Greer striking the same young man outside a patrol car while his partner turned the camera slightly away. That officer was now a sergeant. The room began to shift. Murmurs started. The judge held up a hand to quiet the gallery, but even he looked stunned. Marlene stood slowly and walked to the front of the courtroom. Her heels clicked against the marble like a metronome counting down. She addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, what we are presenting today is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern. A history of behavior protected by a culture of silence and fear. Officer Greer is not the exception. He is the proof." She turned to face the courtroom. "Over the past 10 years, my office has collected over 30 complaints tied to Officer Greer alone. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics, falsified reports. And yet, he remained active. Promoted. Shielded." She paused, letting the words breathe. "Until now." Greer's lawyer stood, his voice urgent and defensive. "Your Honor, we were not given access to these materials in advance. This violates due process," Marlene cut in sharply but without raising her voice. "Your client had years of due process. What he never had was accountability." She turned to Greer directly, for the first time, and her tone shifted, not angry, but pointed, almost surgical. "You thought I was invisible. You thought because I didn't scream, because I didn't resist, because I didn't match your image of authority, that you could erase me like you did all the others." She stepped closer. "But I was never just a face in a hallway. I was the one building the case. Watching. Listening. Documenting. While you were busy silencing victims, I was creating a record you couldn't erase." Greer shifted in his seat, jaw clenched, fingers tapping against the table in rapid, irregular beats. He finally spoke, his voice lower than before, almost uncertain. "You planned this, you baited me." Marlene's expression didn't change. "I didn't bait you. I gave you a chance. And you revealed yourself. That's the difference." Greer leaned forward, his voice rising, desperate now. "So what, this was all a setup? You let me," he stopped himself. Marlene took another step. "I let you do exactly what you've done for years. The only difference was, this time, someone was watching who had the power to stop you." The judge cleared his throat, regaining order. "Ms. Whitaker, please return to your seat. We will now hear the testimony of former Officer Jamal Evers." A door opened, and the young man from the first clip entered. Now in a gray blazer, cleaner, older, but the weight of trauma still behind his eyes. He took the stand. His voice was soft but steady as he began. No one believed me when it happened. I was just another black kid with a record. They said I provoked him. That I must have done something to deserve it. He looked at Greer, then back at the room. But she believed me. She called me a year later. Said my story mattered. That she hadn't forgotten. He swallowed hard. That was the first time anyone said that to me. Over the next hour, more witnesses followed. Victims. Family members. Even former officers who had left the department, disillusioned and broken, finally speaking out. The courtroom transformed from a site of trauma to one of truth. Each story built on the last. A mosaic of pain, long ignored, now undeniable. And through it all, Marlene sat unmoved, absorbing every word not as confirmation, but as fuel. This wasn't about her ego. It was about the people the system had discarded. She had promised herself long ago that if she ever got into a position of power, she wouldn't just climb the ladder, she would burn it down and build a new one. Then came the final moment, the one no one expected. Her assistant handed the judge one last document. A letter. Marlene stood again. This is a formal motion to not only have Officer Greer stripped of his badge and held accountable through the criminal justice system, she said, but also to initiate a departmental integrity audit across the entire precinct, targeting every individual who had a hand in covering up his misconduct. The room erupted in whispers again. The motion meant others would fall. Greer was only the beginning. He stood, knocking his chair back, voice strained and cracking under the pressure. You think you're gonna take me down? After everything I've done for this city? Marlene didn't even blink. You didn't serve this city. You stained it. And now, this city will remember who cleaned it. He stared at her, fury turning to panic. You're gonna regret this. She walked closer, her words final. No. You will. And not because of what I did, because of what you let yourself become. The judge called for a recess. Reporters surged toward the aisle. Greer was escorted out under armed supervision. But no one looked at him anymore. All eyes were on her. People in the gallery stood, quietly, as she exited the courtroom, not in applause, but in recognition. Something had changed. And yet, Marlene knew this wasn't the end. It was just the start of something bigger. Something that would shake not just this department, but the whole damn system. What happened next? Well, even she wasn't sure the city was ready for it. When the courtroom reconvened after recess, there was a different energy in the air. The silence wasn't just a product of order, it was the weight of reckoning settling on every corner of that room. Marlene returned to her seat calmly, her face unreadable, but her posture unshaken. Around her, murmurs of disbelief still lingered. The image of Officer Greer being escorted out in handcuffs moments before was etched into every eye. But this second half of the hearing wasn't about his punishment anymore. It was about exposure, about unraveling every strand of the system that had held him up for so long. As the judge returned, the gavel echoed across the wooden panels, signaling the court back into session. Marlene rose once more, now not only as a prosecutor of the truth but as the voice for those who had been waiting years, some even decades, for justice. She turned toward the gallery, and the air in the room shifted again. You could feel it. Expectation. Fear. Hope. Every emotion colliding in a storm of history. I want to be very clear, she said, her voice low but unwavering, this isn't just about Officer Thomas Greer. This is about every desk that buried a report. Every supervisor who said, not enough evidence. Every training session where silence was taught louder than justice. This system protected him, but it's the same system that punishes young black men for running, for speaking, for breathing too loud. She glanced at the judge, then back at the audience. I'm not here to tear down law enforcement. I'm here to force it to live up to what it claims to be. The judge leaned forward, carefully measured. Ms. Whitaker, you've made compelling statements and presented disturbing evidence. But what do you propose we do with all of this? What happens next? Marlene didn't flinch. We start where all change begins, with the truth. I want this court to authorize a full investigation into the department's internal affairs. I want oversight expanded. And I want Greer's victims, not just the ones here, but all of them, given the platform they were denied. Then came a voice from the back of the courtroom, older, cracked, but firm. A woman in her 70s stood, tears brimming in her eyes. My son died in police custody in '98. They said it was a heart attack. But I know who handled the arrest. It was him. Gasps rippled through the gallery. She slowly stepped forward, holding a folder of aging documents in her trembling hands. They never let me speak. Not once. Marlene motioned to the bailiff, who guided the woman forward. The judge allowed her statement. Her voice trembled as she recounted years of unanswered letters, ignored pleas, closed doors. And then another person stood up. A man in his 50s, scar along his jawline, voice hardened by time. He slammed my face into a windshield in front of my kid. Told me if I complained, I'd regret it. I lost my job. Never got justice. Then another. A woman in her 30s. Then a teenager. One by one, the courtroom filled with confessions that had waited too long to be heard. It wasn't chaos. It was a collective exhale from voices that had been suffocated. And Marlene stood in the center of it, not as a hero, but as the catalyst. Back at the defense table, Greer's secondary attorney sat motionless, absorbing the unfolding disaster. His primary counsel, a younger man who had once been praised for his eloquence in racial sensitivity training workshops, now sat with hands clasped tightly together, sweat beading on his brow. He whispered something to the court clerk, who passed a note to the judge. The judge read it, then looked over at Marlene. Counsel for the defense is requesting to suspend further testimony and explore a plea arrangement with the State Ethics Committee, effective immediately. But Marlene didn't even look at him. Instead, she turned back to the crowd. We're not finished, she said. Not yet. Her assistant brought out a final exhibit, a black binder nearly 3 inches thick. Inside were sealed testimonies, transcripts, and internal reports previously buried under bureaucratic layers. She placed it on the desk in front of her. These are the voices of people who still fear retaliation. People who haven't come forward yet. But they gave me permission to carry their truth here. Today, we give them that space. The judge, now visibly moved, adjusted his robe and nodded solemnly. Proceed. The next testimony was played via recorded video. A former officer, anonymous for safety, spoke through distortion, his voice filtered to protect identity. We were told not to report Greer. You'd lose your shift, your assignments. He was protected by the commander. And the commander knew everything. A hush fell across the room. Marlene looked up from her notes. Your Honor, I have corroborating evidence tying Greer's misconduct to systemic protection from his direct superior, who remains active in the department to this day. The judge's voice cracked slightly. Are you referring to Captain Ronald Trask? Marlene nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And I'm submitting his financial records today, which show undocumented overtime pay approved by Greer in exchange for silence from other officers. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in stunned realization. What started as a single assault had unveiled a network of corruption stretching far beyond one man's actions. Someone in the gallery cried. Someone else cursed under their breath. The judge slammed the gavel to maintain order. But there was no containing what had already spilled into the open. It wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a reckoning. Later, during a recess, Marlene stepped outside the courtroom into a hallway now lined with strangers who looked at her not with fear, not with expectation, but with gratitude. A teenage boy, maybe 15, approached her slowly. "Miss Whitaker," he said, eyes wide, voice soft, "does this mean it's gonna be different now?" She knelt slightly to his level. "Not overnight," she answered, "but it means people will think twice. And that's where it starts." From across the corridor, Marcus Tillman approached her, holding a printed document. "You just made case law," he said quietly. "They'll be citing this hearing in legal textbooks." Marlene exhaled, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but a fire still burning in her chest. "Let them," she replied. "Let them know what happens when silence ends." As they prepared to return to the courtroom for the closing statements, the air buzzed not with chaos, but with conviction. Reporters waited outside. Community leaders were already organizing town halls. Former officers submitted their resignation letters that very hour. And somewhere, deep in the precinct's administration offices, the walls began to sweat. Marlene walked back through the doors not as the woman who had been attacked, but as the woman who dared to answer back with structure, evidence, and unapologetic truth. Her steps were measured, but each one echoed with history, hers, her mother's, the stories of the names in the binder, and the thousands whose lives had been altered by the unchecked cruelty of a man who finally had to look his own actions in the face. She sat, nodded once to the judge, and folded her hands. Now, it was time to close the chapter. But what that chapter would mean, for the courtroom, the city, and the system, was something no one could truly prepare for. The courtroom doors finally shut with a muted thud, the sound echoing down the long corridor like the exhale of a storm that had finally passed, but inside, the tension lingered like the residue of smoke. Marlene stood quietly for a moment at the end of the aisle, the weight of the moment pressing down not as exhaustion, but as gravity. She had exposed them all. Greer. Trask. The hidden files. The conspiracy to protect their own. What had begun as an act of unchecked violence had pulled the mask off a much larger beast, and now that it had been revealed, everyone inside that building understood that nothing would go back to the way it had been. Yet that revelation brought with it something else, something heavier. Because now that truth had been spoken, it demanded to be answered. She made her way back into the side chamber where members of the Oversight Committee, state attorneys, and 2 representatives from the DOJ had gathered spontaneously to debrief. No one had expected the hearing to unfold the way it did. What was meant to be a disciplinary proceeding had become a historic pivot in state accountability. The air in the room was dense, not just with emotion but with uncertainty. And as Marlene entered, the room turned toward her, conversation stalling, as if her presence reminded them of the responsibility now placed on all of them. No more pretending. No more passing the burden forward. One of the DOJ reps, a woman named Kendra Vaughn, closed her notepad and met Marlene's eyes. "You just broke open something we've been trying to prove for years," she said, her voice low but filled with stunned respect. "We thought we'd need subpoenas. You brought us a confession on camera." Marlene didn't nod. She didn't smile. Her voice was tired but firm. "Now what are you going to do with it?" The question hung there. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because exposure was one thing. Reform was another. And she knew the system had a habit of devouring its own scandals to protect itself. Across the table, a senior state official cleared his throat. "We'll launch an independent task force. A restructuring of the disciplinary review process. Maybe a citywide audit, external oversight." Marlene stared at him. "And in 2 years," she asked. "When the headlines fade and people forget? What happens then?" The man looked away. Because that was the real dilemma. The machinery of institutional protection didn't stop with one exposure. It evolved. It adapted. And unless it was dismantled deliberately, it would outlast the outrage. That was what she feared most, that this moment would be remembered as symbolic instead of systemic. Outside, the city was reacting. Protests turned into marches, but not out of fury, out of purpose. Grassroots groups formed alliances, legal aid centers began receiving new applications by the hour, and former officers who had resigned in silence years ago began publicly sharing their stories. The ripples had begun to stretch farther than anyone expected. In Washington, 2 senators cited Marlene's hearing during a debate on police reform funding. A coalition of attorneys general requested access to her investigative files for replication in their own states. But with all this momentum came new threats. Her office received anonymous calls, letters, subtle warnings disguised as jokes. "You've made a lot of enemies," Brianna said one afternoon, closing Marlene's office door after intercepting a suspicious envelope. Marlene looked up from her files, her eyes tired but unwavering. "They've always been there. Now they're just afraid I can see them." Still, she tightened security around her home. She started using a second route to work. She canceled public appearances. She knew how power retaliated when cornered, and she wasn't naive enough to think truth alone would protect her. But not all threats were external. One evening, while reviewing final statements to be filed against Captain Trask, Marlene received an unexpected message. It was from Lorna James, the black detective who had once been her mentor, now navigating the twisted corridors of the department's inner politics. The message was simple. "Can we talk? Off record." They met in a quiet diner outside city limits, far from microphones, far from whispers. Lorna arrived looking over her shoulder, tension wrapped around every step. She slid into the booth and leaned forward. "They're already cleaning house," she said. "Deleting files. Redirecting attention to some other department. Trying to get ahead of the wave." Marlene didn't react. She expected it. "Trask?" she asked. Lorna nodded. "Gone. Early retirement, no formal charges yet. But they'll pin a fall guy. Probably Greer. Paint it as a one-off and move on." And that was the knife to the chest. After everything, every testimony, every victim, every truth finally surfaced, the system still wanted to escape with minimal damage. Like always. Just enough to appear changed. Marlene leaned back in her seat, her heart hammering under her calm exterior. "If they bury this, we lose everything," she whispered. Lorna looked away. "I know. And I'm sorry. But you need to know, they're also coming for you. Not directly. But your name's showing up in smear campaigns. They're leaking personal emails. Suggesting bias, conflict of interest. Trying to turn the conversation from accountability to motive. That was the final complexity of it all. The more a black woman rose, especially one wielding the truth as her weapon, the more the system worked to shift her from hero to threat. Marlene had always known it. She'd lived it. But now, it wasn't about protecting herself. It was about protecting the movement she had ignited. Because this was no longer her story, it belonged to every voice she carried into that courtroom. In the following days, she returned to work with a new strategy. She refused all interviews. Instead, she began organizing a citizen oversight board comprised of victims and former officers who had blown the whistle. Not to replace the system, but to sit beside it, watching. Documenting. Refusing to let it breathe in the dark again. She knew legislation would take years. She knew policies would be bent, manipulated. But culture, that was the battlefield now. If the people didn't trust the system, then they had to be empowered to outwatch it. Meanwhile, Greer remained in custody. His legal team tried to negotiate reduced charges, citing mental health concerns and workplace stress. Marlene reviewed the plea deal they submitted and slid it across the table without comment. She didn't need vengeance. What she needed was precedent. A full trial. Public. Documented. So that no future officer could ever say, "I didn't know," when standing at the edge of crossing a line. But something lingered in the air, something unresolved. One morning, as she walked through the courthouse halls again, this time without cameras, without the crowd, she passed the same corridor where it had all begun. The space was different now. Quieter. The bench where she had dropped her folder was still there. The scratch on the wall where her back had been pressed had been painted over. She stood there for a moment, remembering the way her body had felt, trapped, small, judged before being known. And then she looked ahead, past the corridor, past the doors, and into the chamber where the final ruling was to be made. Because this wasn't over yet. It was only now that the question truly began to echo: what would it cost to truly change the system? And more importantly, who would be willing to pay that price? And as the courtroom prepared once again to open its doors, as the city waited with bated breath for the final ruling, Marlene straightened her shoulders, breathed in the gravity of what was to come, and stepped forward because she wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, she was fighting for memory, for permanence, for the kind of change that doesn't fade with applause and the verdict. It was coming, but what it meant would depend entirely on who had the courage to keep the door open after it was delivered. The final days before the court's ruling unfolded like a slow-burning fuse. Every breath inside the courthouse halls felt thick with consequence, as if each step Marlene took echoed louder than the last. The public was waiting, the city holding itself taut in anticipation, but within the system itself, a silent war was raging, one of positioning, of strategy, of deflection. The old guards behind the scenes weren't going down quietly. They were regrouping. And the closer Marlene got to the conclusion of this chapter, the more she realized the war wasn't just about justice, it was about control of the narrative. And they were determined to take it back. Inside her office, the walls once filled with photos of successful cases and framed certifications were now crowded with stacks of documents, handwritten letters from victims, and legal filings that had become the battleground of reform. Brianna sat across from her, scrolling through online threads, social media campaigns, and headlines that painted Marlene both as a crusader and a manipulator, a hero and a threat. "They're spinning you," she said softly, not lifting her eyes from the screen. "They're saying you used your position to settle a personal vendetta. That you baited Greer. That you let the assault happen just to make a point." Marlene stared at the window, the city glowing outside in hues of muted steel and orange. Her voice was distant but steady. "That's how power works. When it can't deny what you've done, it tries to distort why you did it." There was a long pause. Then Brianna asked something that felt heavier than the room could hold. "Do you ever regret it?" Marlene turned slowly, her eyes locking with hers. "I regret that I had to be the one to do it. I regret that it took something so violent, so visible, for people to finally listen. But regret standing in that courtroom? No. Not even for a second." Later that day, she received a private visit from Reverend Elias Monroe, a long-standing civil rights leader who had watched her journey with quiet admiration. He entered without a word, sat across from her, and placed a small, worn leather notebook on her desk. Marlene opened it and found pages filled with names, dates, notes from past protests, and legal battles long forgotten by the media. "What is this?" she asked. Reverend Monroe's voice was slow, weathered by years of preaching and protest. "It's every fight I've seen us win, and every one we let them take back after we celebrated too soon. Don't let this become another name on that list." Marlene closed the notebook gently and whispered, "I don't plan to." 2 days before the ruling, a letter arrived, slid under her door after hours. No return address. No signature. Just a single sentence scrawled in black ink: "You don't get to walk away from this clean." Marlene read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer beside her mother's old cross necklace, the one she wore during her first court appearance as a public defender. The threat wasn't new. What mattered was what she would do next, knowing it wouldn't stop. She spent the night going over her final arguments, her recommendations, her proposals for long-term reform. She didn't sleep. Instead, she reviewed the names of every victim who had testified, every officer who had come forward, every file that had been resurrected from the archives of indifference. The weight of them felt almost unbearable. But it was the burden she chose, and she would carry it to the end. The morning of the final hearing was gray, the sky overcast as if the city itself understood the gravity of the day. Protesters stood in silence outside the courthouse, holding candles and photographs. Inside, the gallery was packed again, not with anger this time, but with resolve. Marlene entered without ceremony, her step steady, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Greer sat, still in custody, his suit neater than before, his face paler, his eyes tired. But there was no remorse there. Only resignation. And something darker, something like bitterness. He watched her the whole time, as if trying to see the weakness he had never been able to exploit. When the judge entered, the room stood. Then sat. The clerk read out the charges, the motions, and the recommendations. Marlene rose slowly, her final statement clasped in her hands. But before she could speak, the judge raised his hand. "Ms. Whitaker, we've heard your evidence. We've seen your diligence. Before you speak again, I want to ask you something directly. Off record." Marlene blinked, surprised but open. The judge leaned forward. "If we give you everything you're asking for, oversight, audits, accountability, what happens when the cameras go away? When the city forgets? What ensures this doesn't become just another cycle?" Marlene breathed deeply, her response quiet but profound. "We teach them to remember. We put the truth into systems, not just speeches. We institutionalize transparency, not just hope. And we remind them that every silence, every shrug, every paper shuffled over a file, that's how injustice survives. We don't wait for the next video. We prevent it." There was no applause. No outburst. Just a hush. The judge nodded. Then, slowly, gave the ruling. Greer would face trial for assault, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Captain Trask was placed under federal investigation. The entire precinct was subjected to a full Department of Justice audit. A new citizen-led review board was formed, with legal power to challenge internal decisions. Every piece of Marlene's plan had been approved. But it came with one last condition. She had to step down. The judge read the stipulation as if it were just another line on paper, but it hit like a punch. Her presence in the case, her centrality to the exposure, had made her too visible, too powerful. The state feared bias, feared backlash, feared that her continued leadership would be interpreted as a political crusade. For reform to be accepted, the ruling stated, its architect must not become its symbol. Marlene didn't speak right away. The room was still, waiting. Even Greer looked up, confused. The silence lasted a breath too long. Then she nodded once. "I'll resign. On one condition." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Name it." Marlene stepped forward, the full force of her presence crashing down like truth itself. "That you don't let this die after I leave. That this room remembers who made this possible. That every reform, every name cleared, every policy changed, that you trace it back to what happened here. That you say it. Out loud." The judge nodded. And so it was done. She walked out of the courtroom that afternoon not as a prosecutor, not as deputy director, not even as the woman who exposed the system. She walked out as a citizen. One who had forced the law to face itself. Cameras waited outside, flashes lighting up the sky, questions shouted from every angle. But Marlene didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried more weight than any words she could offer. That evening, she returned to her apartment and sat on the floor beside the window, watching the city. The candlelight vigil continued below, and she could hear someone reading the names of victims through a crackling speaker. She whispered each one to herself. Then she reached into the drawer, pulled out the anonymous letter again, and this time, burned it. Because they were wrong. She would walk away from this not clean, but clear. And that was more dangerous than anything they'd feared. The following weeks unraveled like the quiet aftershocks of an earthquake. The ground wasn't trembling anymore, but you could still feel it shifting beneath your feet. Marlene had stepped down. That much the world knew. What the public didn't see, what few truly understood, was that her resignation wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. She had exited the stage the way she entered it, with purpose, with silence that echoed louder than the noise of the headlines. But behind that silence, beneath the surface of what they believed to be the end of her story, she was still moving pieces. Strategizing. Watching. Inside the old community center in East Baltimore, the one her mother used to bring her to for Saturday reading programs, Marlene met quietly with a coalition of attorneys, organizers, and victims. No suits. No reporters. Just people. Raw, weathered, real. They gathered around folding tables and passed around files, some of them still warm from the printer. It wasn't about building a case now, it was about building infrastructure. Structures that didn't rely on her title, or her badge, or her access to courtrooms. Structures that could exist on the outside of the system and still shake it from the core. Marcus Tillman leaned in over the files, his eyes catching the fatigue in hers. "You're not done, are you?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Marlene exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of her neck. "I don't think I'll ever be done," she said. "But now I get to do this my way." A young woman at the far end of the table, barely 21, once arrested during a peaceful protest and later cleared by Marlene's oversight, spoke up. "You think they'll come after you again?" Marlene looked at her for a long moment. "I think they already are. But it doesn't matter. They've already lost control of the story." The city, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to the new landscape. The newly instated review board was operational but fragile. Still figuring out its language. Still negotiating its authority. Members of the press who once praised Marlene's courage began to shift tones, questioning her motives, casting her as both too radical and not radical enough. She had become a symbol, and symbols were easy to distort. In City Hall, lawmakers who had fast-tracked policies under public pressure now started slow-walking their implementation, citing logistical concerns and budget evaluations. And within the police department, Trask's investigation had triggered a chain reaction: transfers, quiet retirements, reassigned officers. But still, no official public apology. No admission of wrongdoing. Just silence where accountability should have lived. Late one evening, Marlene received a message on her personal phone. Unknown number. Just a voice message. She hesitated, then played it. It was Greer's voice. Raspy. Bitter. Defiant. "You think you won? You didn't change a damn thing. They'll replace me. They always do. And when they do, they'll be smarter. Quieter. And you'll be forgotten." She listened to the whole message without flinching, her hand resting on the glass of water by her nightstand. After it ended, she stared at the screen for a long time, then calmly deleted it. Greer still hadn't learned. And that, more than anything, proved how deep the rot had gone. Days later, she stood outside the youth center downtown, speaking softly to a group of high school students about civic engagement and the cost of truth. A boy with tight curls and a sharp mind raised his hand. "Miss Whitaker, what happens if we do everything right, and it still doesn't change?" Marlene didn't rush her answer. She looked at his face, young but already worn by awareness. "Then you do it again. And again. Until it does. Because if we stop, then they win. Not because they're stronger, but because we got tired." That same week, the first report from the DOJ audit was released. It confirmed everything Marlene had exposed: patterns of racial profiling, falsified reports, a complete breakdown of internal accountability. Names were named. Files unsealed. What had once been suspicion was now evidence. Greer's trial date was set. Trask's retirement was publicly labeled as part of ongoing disciplinary review. The city tried to keep the language soft, but the truth was loud enough. And while Marlene wasn't inside the system anymore, her fingerprints were all over its transformation. One night, Lorna James invited her to dinner. They met at a small restaurant tucked into a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place without cameras, without expectations. Over plates of collard greens and grilled catfish, Lorna leaned in, voice quiet but heavy. "They're watching me now," she said. "Internal Affairs is sniffing around. Trying to figure out what I knew when I knew it. Asking why I didn't speak sooner." Marlene sipped her tea, then asked, "Do you regret coming forward?" Lorna shook her head, her eyes glassy. "No. But I'm scared. I see how they treat you. How they talk about you when you're not in the room. You broke their shield, March. Now they want to break you." Marlene placed her hand over Lorna's. "Let them try," she said. "But remember this, they can't kill what's already been exposed. They can discredit me. They can try to bury my name. But they can't unmake the truth." Lorna smiled, the kind of smile that trembles at the edges but still holds. "Sometimes I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." Marlene looked down, quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I think I just got tired of being afraid." That night, she walked alone through her neighborhood, the streets quieter than usual. She passed storefronts that had boarded up during the protests and never reopened. She passed murals of names turned into hashtags. She passed a group of kids playing on the sidewalk, laughing the way only children can after darkness. And she wondered, not if change would come, but if those kids would one day live in a city where they wouldn't have to fight for the right to be heard. When she got home, her inbox was flooded again. Requests for interviews. Invitations to speak. Appearances. Opportunities to brand herself. To turn the movement into a platform. She deleted them all. Then opened a new document. No headers. No preface. Just a blank page. And she began to write, not a report, not a speech, not a memo. A record. A preservation of what had happened. A document not for courts or councils, but for the next woman who would sit where she once sat. For the next black girl who would be told she was too much, too loud, too angry, too complicated to lead. As she wrote, her phone buzzed. A text. From Brianna. It said only, "The review board just blocked a disciplinary expungement. First time in history." Marlene smiled. Not because it was over, but because it wasn't. And yet, something had shifted. Because now, when the system whispered that she'd been erased, there were already 100 others speaking her name. And the story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the people. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been as the final verdict came down. Officer Thomas Greer was found guilty on all charges: assault under color of authority, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice. The jury had deliberated for just under 4 hours, the weight of testimony and evidence far too damning to ignore. As the judge read the sentencing, 15 years without the possibility of early parole, Greer didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. His face had lost all the arrogant defiance it once carried. What remained was not remorse, but an emptiness that seemed to recognize, perhaps too late, the cost of believing he would always be protected by his badge. He was led away in cuffs, his final glance not at the gallery, but at the floor beneath his feet. He had spent his life believing he could stand above others, only to leave the courtroom smaller than anyone imagined. Captain Ronald Trask's fall was quieter, but equally devastating. After a thorough federal investigation, he was charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and dereliction of duty. While he avoided prison time due to a plea deal, his name was permanently removed from any future public service eligibility. He lost his pension. He lost the silence that once insulated him. And most of all, he lost the comfort of being forgotten. His legacy was rewritten, not by angry protesters, but by facts carved into law. He moved out of state shortly after the ruling, disappearing into a life of obscurity where his name was no longer followed by medals, but by disgrace. But perhaps the most surprising turn belonged to Lorna James. After months of scrutiny, whispers, and internal pressure to resign, she did something no one expected. She ran for Chief of Internal Affairs, and won. Supported by community leaders, former victims, and a newly empowered oversight board, Lorna became the first black woman to lead that department. Her leadership didn't bring instant reform, but it brought something even rarer, accountability from within. She rebuilt her team from the ground up, hiring people who had once been dismissed as too emotional or too unorthodox. She kept a photo of Marlene on her desk, tucked inside a drawer, not as an idol, but as a reminder of what courage demanded every day. As for Brianna, Marlene's once soft-spoken assistant, the fire she found during the movement never left her. She enrolled in law school the following year, focusing on civil rights litigation. She wrote her entrance essay about the power of being close to a revolution, even if you're not the one holding the microphone. She kept in touch with Marlene, often sending case notes, legal updates, and sometimes just checking in to say, "I haven't forgotten." And then there was Marlene Whitaker. She didn't return to public office. She didn't start a consulting firm. She didn't publish a book, despite countless offers. Instead, she founded something quiet, almost invisible, a foundation dedicated to training youth in legal literacy, teaching them how to navigate the system before the system ever touched them. The programs weren't glamorous. There were no TV interviews, no press conferences. But every week, in libraries, community centers, and school auditoriums, she stood in front of young people and taught them how to fight with facts, how to speak in rooms designed to ignore them, how to recognize injustice not as fate, but as something that could be challenged. The first girl to graduate from her program became the youngest person ever hired by the City Ethics Review Board. The second became a public defender. The third, a reporter who refused to let stories like Marlene's get rewritten by convenience. Marlene lived without apology, but also without bitterness. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had seen the worst of people and still chose to build. Her name came up often in conversations, on panels, in classrooms. Some called her a warrior. Others, a strategist. But those who knew her best understood, she wasn't interested in being remembered. She was interested in ensuring no one else was forgotten. On the one-year anniversary of the trial, a mural was unveiled in downtown Baltimore. It featured no names. Just a courtroom, a raised voice, and behind it, rows and rows of faces, black, brown, young, old, painted not as victims, but as witnesses. At the corner of the mural was a small plaque. It didn't mention Marlene directly. It simply read, "When silence is no longer an option, speak so the walls remember." That was all she ever wanted, to leave behind something that couldn't be erased. And now I turn to you. What would you have done in Marlene's place? Would you have stayed quiet, knowing the cost of speaking up? Would you have walked away, or walked through the fire? We like to believe we'd all be heroes when injustice stands in front of us. But heroism rarely looks like it does in movies. Sometimes it's calm. Strategic. Sometimes it's painful. Unseen. It's in the moments when you're told to step back, but your spirit says step forward. It's in the hallway where everyone else looks away, and you choose to stay. This story wasn't just about corruption or power. It was about the weight of choosing truth in a world that rewards silence. And that's a choice we each face, whether we're in a courtroom or a classroom or a conference room. So what will you choose? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let us know how this story moved you, what questions it left you with, and most importantly, what you would have done if it had been you in that hallway. We want to hear your voice. Because stories like this don't end with one person. They live on through the people who carry them forward. And if this story hit you deep, if it made you feel, think, reflect, then make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and join us for more true-feeling stories that challenge, shock, and inspire. We've only just begun.